Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're kicking things off today with a story so big it's almost hard to believe. It's the story of Bernard Madoff and his $65 billion Ponzi scheme. I mean, that number, it's not just a number, right? It represents so many lives that were affected. It's a complete breakdown of trust. And this is exactly the kind of thing we're going to be talking about on the Deep Dive, what we're calling Fraudcast. So every week we're diving into the world of white-collar crime.
Yeah. We're not just looking back at a financial scandal from the past. We're trying to understand how deception works, how our financial systems can be so vulnerable, and how human nature plays a role in these huge frauds. And for everyone listening, getting a handle on the Madoff case is really important. It gives you this lens to view other financial crimes through.
For sure. So for this first Fraudcast Deep Dive, we've put together a complete look at Bernard Madoff. We'll cover his background, how his firm operated, the legitimate side and the hidden Ponzi scheme, that shocking moment when it all came crashing down, and the fallout from it all. We really want to break down this complex story, highlight the key takeaways, and show you how this massive fraud happened and why it stayed hidden for so long. Get ready for some surprising details and hopefully a few aha moments that will shed light on this dark side of finance.
So to start unraveling this, we got to understand the man at the center, Bernard Madoff. And, he wasn't some nobody. He had a big presence in the financial world.
Right. Born in Brooklyn back in 1938. His early life seemed pretty normal. Went to a few different universities, ended up with a political science degree from Hofstra. But the financial markets, that's where he found his thing. Started a penny stock brokerage in 1960 with a little bit of his own money and a loan from his father-in-law. That small start turned into Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities.
And what's really interesting is this company had these two almost separate parts. On one side, you had a legitimate, pretty successful market-making operation. By 2008, they were a major player, the sixth largest market maker in S&P 500 stocks. To explain that a bit, a market maker basically makes trading smoother. They're ready to buy or sell securities at certain prices, keeping the market liquid. Madoff even became chairman of NASDAQ for a time. That gave him a lot of credibility.
But then, almost in secret, there was this asset management business. It was super exclusive, very low profile. And as we know now, that's where the Ponzi scheme was happening. And it wasn't just Madoff. His family was heavily involved too. His brother Peter, who was a senior managing director, and get this, the chief compliance officer. It's crazy. Peter's daughter, Shana, she was in compliance too, working as a rules officer and attorney for the firm. And Madoff's sons, Mark and Andrew, they worked on the legitimate side of the business.
That deep family involvement, it's something we see in a lot of these big financial frauds. It creates this atmosphere of trust. Of course, it's tragically misplaced trust in this case, but it can blind investors and regulators. It makes you wonder, how much did the people closest to him really know or suspect?
It does make you wonder, and the way the whole thing fell apart, it was pretty dramatic. December 10th, 2008, Madoff's own sons, Mark and Andrew, they went to the authorities. They told the FBI that their father had confessed. The asset management side, it was all a giant Ponzi scheme. One big lie, is what he reportedly said.
Wow, imagine how shocked and betrayed his sons must have felt.
Taxes stressing you out? Don't worry, 1-800-ACCOUNTANT is here. Expert help, affordable rates. Call 1-800-ACCOUNTANT today and leave the headaches to the tax pros. Click the link below.
The very next day, the FBI arrested Madoff. He was charged with securities fraud. And it's a big reminder that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they're supposed to be regulating the markets. Well, they had actually investigated Madoff before, multiple times. But they never uncovered the real extent of the fraud. We'll definitely have to look into why those investigations didn't find anything.
Absolutely. But at least the legal process moved quickly after that. By March 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty. 11 federal felonies. He admitted that his supposedly successful wealth management business had been a lie for decades.
And with that guilty plea, the full size of the one big lie started to become clear. Madoff said the Ponzi scheme started in the early 1990s. But what's really unsettling is that a former trader for Madoff, he confessed to faking records. And not just recently. He said he started doing it way back in the early 1970s. So now there's this chilling possibility that maybe the investment management side of Madoff's firm, maybe it was a fraud from the very beginning.
It's hard to fathom, right? The total missing from client accounts, it was a staggering amount, around $65 billion. That included all those years of fake investment gains. The trustee appointed by the SIPC, the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, they estimated the actual direct losses to be close to $18 billion. The good news, if you can call it that, is that a lot of that money has been recovered. Over $14 billion has been returned to investors. And they're still working on getting more back. In June 2009, Madoff was given the maximum sentence, 150 years in prison. His confession showed how he did it. It was shockingly simple, but incredibly effective. He took investor money, just deposited it into a bank account at JP Chase, and then used new deposits to pay out the people who wanted to withdraw their money. Classic Ponzi scheme. Or you could just call it stealing.
Yeah. There was no fancy investment strategy behind those supposed high returns. It was just moving money around, with Madoff and maybe others pocketing a lot of it, all while making his clients think they were getting rich. He admitted that there hadn't been any real investments happening in the Ponzi scheme part of his business since at least 1991.
So all those account statements showing consistent, better than the market returns, they were totally made up. He had office staff creating those fake trading reports, based on whatever returns he told them to use. They even used a computer program to backdate trades and mess with account statements, making it look like there was real, profitable trading going on.
And to make the illusion even more convincing, they came up with these fancy-sounding baskets of stocks. They said they were based on the closing prices of the S&P 100 and other top-performing stocks, and they gave it a complicated name, a split-strike conversion strategy. Now, a real split-strike conversion, that is a real option strategy. It's just pretty complex. But Madoff just misused that term to make things sound sophisticated, probably hoping to keep investors from looking too closely at what was actually happening, or more accurately, what wasn't happening.
It's like a magician, right? They use all this jargon to distract you from the simple trick they're pulling.
Exactly. And Madoff was incredibly secretive about how much money he was managing. He knew that if people found out the real amount, they'd start asking questions. How could he possibly be making such consistent returns with that much money without affecting the market in a big way? His secrecy wasn't about being exclusive. It was about hiding the fraud. And that brings us to a really important part of this story. All the red flags that people raised, and all the chances that were missed to catch this fraud much sooner. This is the part that's especially frustrating for the people who lost everything.
You're right. The most well-known example, and maybe the biggest indictment of the regulators, is Harry Markopolos. Starting way back in 1999, he kept telling the SEC that Madoff's returns were impossible, mathematically impossible. For almost a decade, he provided detailed evidence, basically laying out the whole Ponzi scheme. And the SEC, they mostly ignored him. It makes you wonder, what more did they need?
It's really mind-blowing. This was an independent financial analyst. He had no inside information, but he was able to figure out the fraud pretty quickly, and he presented a clear case to the regulators. But the very agencies whose job it is to protect investors, they didn't do anything. And it wasn't just him. Big derivatives firms, people on Wall Street, they also stayed away from Madoff. They suspected something was wrong with his consistently high returns. These weren't amateurs. These were financial pros. They could smell a rat.
And it wasn't just the returns. People questioned how Madoff's tiny accounting firm could possibly be handling all his business. It was a small operation. 3 people, only 1 active accountant. How could they audit the books for such a huge enterprise? It just didn't add up.
But even with all those inconsistencies, the SEC, they investigated Madoff multiple times in 1992, 2004, and in the years leading up to his collapse. And every time, they failed to find the fraud.
Trade in your boring job for a brilliant career using Adobe Creative Cloud. Start learning now with the free trial link in the description.
You have to ask, what was going wrong with those investigations? Did they not have enough resources, not enough expertise? Or was something else going on?
There are even some disturbing details from a 2004 SEC investigation. A lawyer involved in that investigation, he recommended more questioning, a deeper look into Madoff's trading. But reportedly, he was told to stop. Why would that happen?
Yeah, that's a really troubling question. And then there's this connection between an SEC assistant director and Madoff's niece. They met while his agency was investigating her uncle's firm. That particular investigation was closed, and they ended up getting married. A spokesperson said the guy wasn't involved in any investigations while he was dating Madoff's niece, but it definitely looks bad. It makes you question the SEC's oversight.
It does, and here's a really chilling detail. Madoff himself, while he was waiting to be sentenced, he reportedly talked to the SEC's Inspector General. He said that it would have been easy to uncover the fraud. All they had to do was check his stock records. He said they never even did that. He thought that should have been the first thing they did if they suspected a Ponzi scheme.
It's almost hard to believe. It makes you think there were huge failures within the regulatory system, and the consequences of those failures were devastating. So many people and institutions were hurt by Madoff's one big lie.
It was a tragedy. Thousands of investors, Many of them ordinary people who had put their life savings into Madoff's hands. They lost everything. And the impact went way beyond individuals. Charitable organizations like Hadassah, the Elie Wiesel Foundation, Jewish federations, hospitals, they were all hit hard. Some of them had to shut down or cut way back because of the huge losses.
This wasn't just about losing money. It ruined lives, destroyed futures, and made people lose trust in the entire financial system. And there's another layer to this that makes it even worse. Madoff specifically targeted wealthy American Jewish communities.
Yeah, that aspect of it, the affinity fraud, it's really disturbing. He used his own identity, his connections within those communities to gain people's trust and get their investments. It's a stark example of how a shared identity can be exploited for criminal purposes.
It shows how important it is to be skeptical, even when you're dealing with people within your own community, especially when it comes to money. But in the middle of all this devastation, there have been some really big efforts to recover the lost funds.
Luckily, the SIPC trustee, Irving Picard, he's been leading this massive effort to claw back money and give it back to the victims. As of today, they've recovered over $14 billion. They've been using different legal tactics, including what are called clawback lawsuits. Those are against investors who took out more money than they originally put in the years before the scheme collapsed. It's controversial because some of those people were victims too, but the goal is to try to recover as much as possible for everyone who was defrauded.
One of the big wins in that effort was a $7.2 billion settlement with Jeffrey Picower's estate. He was one of the people who benefited the most from the fraud. And on top of what the SIPC is doing, the government also set up the Madoff Victim Fund. That's to provide more money to the people who suffered losses.
It's a long and complex process. And for a lot of people, the recovered money will never make up for what they lost. But the fact that they've managed to return so much is a testament to the people who are working on the recovery effort. It's also important to consider the influence that Madoff and his family had, not just in finance, but in politics too.
Right. Public records show that Madoff and his wife, they donated a lot of money to politicians over the years. And members of the Madoff family, they held leadership roles in big securities industry organizations like the NASD, SIFMA, and the DTCC. They were really embedded in the system. That probably contributed to the image that Madoff was legitimate. And that might have made it harder for people to believe he was capable of such a huge fraud. It makes you think about how those kinds of connections might hinder regulatory scrutiny.
Yeah. It seems like he was really part of the establishment. That maybe made it even harder for people to believe he could betray so many people. And when you look at Madoff's own behavior, there are some interesting details there.
He really tried to make his asset management business seem exclusive. He kept it low-key, even told investors not to tell anyone about their relationship with him. That secrecy, some people might have seen it as a sign of prestige, but really it should have been a big red flag. Legitimate investment managers are usually open about their strategies and how well they're doing.
Exactly. And later, after he was convicted and sent to prison, he reportedly said some pretty interesting things. He even compared how he was being treated in prison to how a mafia don would be treated. Maybe that shows he still had a big ego, or maybe he just didn't understand how his crimes were perceived. And there was also a report that he and his wife tried to commit suicide together after the fraud was exposed. It just goes to show how much damage was done to his family and to him personally.
So as we wrap up this first deep dive into the Madoff scandal, our first Fraudcast, what are the big takeaways for you, our listeners?
Well, first of all, the size of this deception is almost unbelievable. But the way the fraud worked, it was actually pretty simple. It wasn't some super complicated high-tech scheme. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, dressed up with financial jargon and an image of exclusivity. The human cost was huge. So many lives were affected. People lost faith in financial institutions. And the fact that so many red flags were missed for so many years, it shows that there are some serious problems with the regulators who are supposed to be protecting investors. The fact that the fraud could have been caught so easily, as Madoff himself said, that's a really sobering thought.
Absolutely. And the big takeaway here is that due diligence is so important at every level, from individual investors to huge institutions. The Madoff case is a reminder that even people and firms that seem totally trustworthy can commit massive fraud. It makes us think about how much we trust financial professionals, and we should always be skeptical of returns that seem too good to be true.
And that leads us to a final question, maybe a bit of an unsettling one. Given all the warnings, the investigations, the red flags, what does the Madoff scandal tell us about the challenges of regulating the financial world? And maybe even more importantly, what's our responsibility as investors? Do we need to be more skeptical? Do we need to scrutinize even the people we trust the most and the opportunities that seem the most promising? Where do you draw the line between trust and healthy questioning in your own financial life? It's a balance we all have to figure out, especially in a world where, as we've seen in this broadcast, even the biggest financial lies can seem real for a long time.
Yes, that's a really important point for all of us to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Madoff fraud. It's the first of many explorations we'll be doing into the world of white-collar crime.